All
Okay.
right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Gnostic Media's UnSpun episode number 172 with Dr. E. Michael Jones. Dr. Jones, I'm happy to have you here tonight. I'm happy to have you on to discuss your book, Dionysos Rising. I had done a series of shows last year, maybe almost 2 years ago now. It took a long time to produce it, with Dr. Hans Utter laying out basically a lot of the, we sort of start where your book almost, or you start at the beginning. You start at an earlier point, and we kind of finish it off and bring it into social engineering with the Tavistock Institute and Theodore Adorno and the Princeton Radio Project and all of these things. And then we bring it forward and through the intelligence community to the present through that. But you really tie in the nuts and bolts starting back much further. So I'm happy to have you on to really get into the nuts and bolts of that. So welcome to the show.
Thank
And
you. Thank you. Good to be.
You're cutting out a little bit there. And you were actually on the show. What was it? You were on my RBN show, I suppose, about 2.5 years ago or something like that.
Okay.
But anyway, so glad to have you back. So I sent you an outline of some of the things I'd like to talk about. But first off, I want to start talking about Richard Wagner or Wagner. And, what was happening in Dresden, 1848?
Well, the main thing that was happening was a revolution. Basically, when the revolution, when the French Revolution swept through Europe under Napoleon exported the French Revolution to the rest of Europe. All of the laws that were put in place to protect Christians from exploitation were simply overturned. And a new era began and new laws were put in place. And one of the main principles was equality. Equality of all people. Everybody was the same. There were no difference. The most significant group this impacted was the Jews. Napoleon insisted on emancipating the Jews because he needed to invade Russia. He needed their help in invading Russia. And he set in motion forces that he couldn't have foreseen. 100 years after the revolution, the French Revolution, the Catholic magazine Civiltà Cattolica did a 3-part series on the Jewish question. And the summary of it was basically that any Christian country that abandons the laws that were put in place by Christian kings will be ruled by Jews. It was just a stunning statement. The Catholic Church put its weight behind this. This was in the official journal of the Vatican, run by the Jesuits. And that summed up 100 years of basically the experience of revolution in Europe. Wagner comes in the middle of this. Both Bishop von Kettler and Friedrich Engels both agreed that the revolution of 1848 was a revolution against capitalism. It was what happened to the people after those laws protecting them were struck down was ruthless economic exploitation. And that's what led to the revolution. The potato famine contributed to it. It wasn't as bad in Europe as it was in Ireland, but it contributed to the famine, to the unrest. And Wagner suddenly finds himself up in a steeple directing fire against the Prussian army. His position becomes untenable. He's got to get out, so he basically heads out of town along with the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin and goes to Switzerland, goes into exile. He's wanted by the Prussian government. They put out wanted posters for him, but he escapes to Switzerland. He goes into exile there. And at this point, he starts to think through why did this revolution fail? Why did the revolution fail? Or is there a way that we can proceed uh, uh, even though it has failed? Is there some type of liberation we can still achieve? The first question Wagner answered by writing the Ring trilogy. The Ring trilogy beginning with Das Rheingold, which is about capitalism. It's one of the most brilliant expositions of capitalism that exists. It's like the mythic roots of capitalism, which is basically the Rhine maidens at the beginning of the opera, the first opera of the cycle, Ring cycle, are swimming. They're guarding the treasure of Germany, which is Das Rheingold, which lies at the bottom of the Rhine. Suddenly Alberich comes, and Alberich, everyone knew at that time, was a Jew. He was, in many ways, a representative of the Rothschild family because what he did was basically privatize the gold, just as the Rothschild family had privatized the gold of the Prince of Hesse-Kassel. He steals the gold, makes a ring out of it. The ring is basically the gold standard or capitalism, and this is how he rules the world with an iron rod. That's Wagner's explanation of what happened. His explanation of how to get out of it or what possibilities were still left turned out to be Tristan und Isolde. And you have here the kind of weird combination of left-wing politics that protests against economic injustice, which is fine, that's a good idea, but at the same time sees the sexual order or sexual morality as a manifestation of economic exploitation. That's the exact opposite. The left got that completely wrong. That's completely wrong. Morality is the only thing that protects weak people against the strong who want to impose their will on the strong. Right. Morality protects them. So Wagner is sitting there in Switzerland, and he comes up with this, basically a new vehicle for expressing sexual liberation, and it's basically his use of chromaticism, the chromatic scale as opposed to the diatonic scale. And if you want a really good demonstration of this, you should listen to his opera Tannhäuser. Tannhäuser is about the conflict going on in Wagner. It has one of those strongest melodies that Wagner came up with, the Pilgrim's Chorus. It's one of those melodies you hear it the first time and you just stop dead in your tracks and you think that's a great piece of music, which is what happened to me when I heard it. A few pieces that's been this way. This is one of them. You have this conflict with Wagner hearing the Pilgrim Chorus, that strong melody, which is the pilgrims going to Rome. He's drawn to Christianity, which is the defender of melody. But at the same time, he's drawn to the Venusberg, which is basically his sexual fantasies, unlimited sexual liberation. And the unlimited nature of it is expressed by chromaticism. With chromaticism, you never seem, or let's put it this way.
And what is chromaticism?
Chromaticism it's basically equal tones with no differentiation, whereas the diatonic scale has gaps in it that give it a kind of drama. So with the diatonic scale, you end up back where you started. So a melody, Wagner perceived, this is part of his weirdness, but Wagner perceived melody as something tyrannical because you sort of end up back where you started. So to give an example of what melody is like, melody basically is the plot of music. I'm a rower. I row on the St. Joe River on a regular basis. And sometimes I get caught in storms. And then rowing gets really dramatic. And melody is a little bit like starting off from the dock, and everything's fine. And then suddenly the storm rolls in and I'm scared. It's thunder, it's lightning. I got 2 oars out there that are basically great conductors of electricity. I'm in the middle of open water. And if the lightning hits me, I'm toast. It's over. So it builds up, you get this tension, and suddenly the storm passes and you get back to the dock and you heave a big sigh of relief. That's what music is like. That's what these great, an example of this would be Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, which is exactly what I just talked about. There's even a thunderstorm in the middle of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. So basically, music arouses the emotions. It stimulates the emotions to the point where the emotions look as if they're going to get out of control, and then it brings it back to where you started, and everything's resolved, and you have this feeling of catharsis, the feeling you've been through something, and you feel better because you survived it. So it's like rowing through a thunderstorm and getting back to the dock. Now that's what melody is. Now, why Wagner perceived this as the enemy is anybody's guess. I think the main reason is because of his unruly sexual passions. And so as an alternative to this, which is one of the basic organizational principle of music, he provides this diatonic scale where you just keep sort of shifting from one mood to another, and you set off and you never get back to the dock. You just row off forever, or you sail off forever, or you leave sight of the coastline. And it's like unlimited sexual. It's like stimulation upon stimulation. It's like unending sexual pleasure. That's what Tristan and Isolde is. And that became a hugely intoxicating piece of music that had, I would say, devastating consequences for all of Europe.
Yeah, and we don't think of a piece of classical music or something like that setting out to be this to launch this massive cultural revolution and to destroy society. But when we trace it back, and I mentioned my work with Dr. Hans Utter, and we trace it back quite a bit, but what you're seeing then is, from Wagner, it goes into Nietzsche, and from Nietzsche, Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth, she's working with Rudolf Steiner, and puts him as the head of the Nietzsche library, and then you see all of this occult stuff spread out everywhere from there. Yeah. And into Schoenberg, and then into the rest of society. And from the Tavistock Institute, we see this stuff being directly implemented from there and through the Frankfurt School into the CIA's MKUltra program, which I've documented extensively and which is in that other series. But now we can begin to see an entire chain of events between your work and the work that we've laid out, beginning with Wagner.
Yeah. Yeah, Hans Wiesengrund Adorno, member of the Frankfurt School, was a crucial player in this regard in terms of weaponizing music. But the first real convert, as you mentioned, was Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a 17-year-old, got a hold of the piano score of Tristan and Isolde, played it, and was completely swept away by the music. I mean, completely swept away. To the point, and this I think this is true. I mean, there's dispute about this, where he consecrated himself to sexual liberation in a sort of demonic consecration, where he went out and deliberately infected himself with syphilis. Now, this was substantiated by Nietzsche's friend Peter Gast. Peter Gast visited Nietzsche at the end of his life in the insane asylum, and Nietzsche told him this. But it became part of the legacy of Wagner through Thomas Mann in particular. Thomas Mann talked about how his generation was completely swept away by Tristan und Isolde. They used to listen to it every year. It became like a kind of pilgrimage, going to Bayreuth and listening to this. And it just had an intoxicating effect on an entire generation. His particular expression of it would be Death in Venice, where the writer who is neurasthenic and goes to Venice for recuperation, falls in love with this Polish teenager. The plague breaks out, and is it worth dying for? Is sex worth dying for? It became an existential question during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, right. And Michel Foucault answered yes. Michel Foucault was a disciple of Nietzsche. He said, yes, it's worth dying for. And lo and behold, he died for it. died of AIDS after spending a lot of time in the bathhouses of San Francisco. This is the crisis that it precipitated in Europe. And Nietzsche was the man who did it. So if you go to Death in Venice, there is this Dionysian festival there. It's taken right from Nietzsche. It's one of the most powerful passages in all of German literature, as far as I'm concerned. And he got it directly from Nietzsche, who basically took Wagner and he became the St. Paul of the Wagnerian gospel, spreading it, weaponizing it, turning it into some type of philosophical construct.
All right, so let's see. You talk about the order of creation was love bound together in a unity of the mathematical and the musical. Would you like to explain that? I think this is key.
That was the Pythagorean understanding of the relationship between their understanding of logos involved a kind of musical understanding of the universe. This, by the way, is in Merchant of Venice. Shakespeare had this notion, got this notion from the philosophical tradition that was available to him. And when Lorenzo runs off with Jessica is the daughter of Shylock. She's a Jew. She's not a Christian. She is part of a religion that rejects logos, reject the logos incarnate, and rejects all logos. And so she needs a little training, a little teaching. And Lorenzo takes her outside and he points to the sky and he talks about the music of the spheres, talks about the stars having some type of musical relationship to each other.
Right, which is directly out of the quadrivium, actually. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
It's a traditional understanding. Basically, what we're saying here is that there is a logos, there is an order to the universe. And it's our duty as human beings to understand this order and to basically subordinate our lives to the logos that the Creator put there for us. The Jew, because he is in rebellion against logos, doesn't understand this. So Shylock is a man that doesn't hear music. He hates music because he hates logos and he hates the order of the universe. And Shakespeare puts this expression in his mouth by having him reject music. Jessica needs tutoring in logos, and that's why Lorenzo points to the sky and the order of the universe and calls it a kind of music. That's the music of the spheres. The universe is like a symphony, or a symphony gives us some sense of incredible complexity on the one hand.
That is just so mind-blowing. You can only grasp it essentially, but you can't really explain it. And to explain it is to distort it or to create some Dionysian, essentially what becomes a death cult of society, against it.
Well, I think you can experience it.
Right. That's what I mean.
The experience of logos we call beauty. When if it's art, your life is like there's existence and there's essence, and the existence is you can experience the existence, but you can't comprehend it. And when it comes to essence, you can comprehend it, but you can't experience it. But when you experience it and comprehend it at the same time, that's a powerful experience, and we call that beauty. And that's beauty in art, visual art, but it's also beauty in music. And the music I think the beauty in music comes with that resolution of emotion at the end. Like let's take another example from music. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony is a revolutionary piece of music. And the revolutionary forces always seem as if they're on the verge of getting out of control, but yet finally there's kind of Promethean struggle, and he finally brings it all back to that final chord, and everything's resolved at the end. And everybody, you feel happy. It feels as if you've been through the war and you survived. That's beauty. That's the experience of beauty in music. And that is precisely what Wagner challenged when he wrote Tristan und Isolde. He challenged that whole notion that there is an order to the melody, to the melodic line, that you have to subordinate your ideas to. He broke with that. He said, I'm going to have sexual liberation. I'm going to have sex on my terms. It's going to go on forever. And I don't care what the consequences are. And he set a precedent, as I said, that was deadly, I think, for Europe.
Now, and speaking of that, how is the state order or the state of order taken from music?
Well, I mean, you've got the notes, you've got the easiest way to talk about it is in terms of emotion. The music has this ability to go directly into the soul and bypass the understanding and arouse emotions. The simplest way of saying this is like, what's the difference between a major chord and a minor chord? Well, there's a different emotion attached to them. A major chord is like a sunny day. A minor chord is different. It's different. It's brooding. It's not sunny, and so on and so forth. So the music has the ability to arouse these emotions. The order comes in when you resolve this aroused emotion in some type of emotionally satisfying, logical way. That's when you come back to where you started. That's where you feel a sense of resolution, where you find that you touch the note again that you started off on. And you feel as if you've been through something and you survived it. And Aristotle, he talks about drama in this regard, but it applies in many ways more to music than it does to drama. He calls it catharsis. He says there's a sense of pity and fear that you get from watching a great man fall. I think the same feeling is without content, without words, even more powerfully expressed with music, when the emotions are aroused and then resolved at the end. That's the order that I'm talking about. It shows you that there's an order to the universe. It shows you how your soul corresponds to that order in the universe.
Now, Michael, do you have a copy of your book, Dionysos Rising, with you?
I had it at the other computer. I had to change computers to get on Zoom, and I left the book across the street.
Oh, so no.
I don't have the copy there.
Okay. Well, there was... well, I have it here, so I will do my best to read your work well then. How's that?
Okay, go ahead.
So let's see. What you're talking about is, well, you start off with Wagner. Wagner's choice of the word harmony in this context is both predictable and revolutionary at the same time. Wagner was, of course, writing as a musician at the time, but his use of the word harmony bespoke more than a simple professional interest. Harmony, even in Wagner's time, was still the concept that transcended the merely musical. Harmony was another word for order. The tranquillitas sorry, I don't have Latin background. Ordinus, mentioned by Augustine, was the manifestation, or was manifest in creation, in society, and in the individual's soul in terms that were synonymous with terms musical. In addition to that, he also draws on the whole history of music in the West as associated with both external and internal order through the concept of harmony. Each creature, wrote Goethe in a letter dated November 17, 1789, is nothing more than a sound, a shading of great harmony, which one must study in its magnitude and entirety. Otherwise, each individual is nothing more than a dead letter. According to both the ancients and their Christian followers, the order of creation was love, bound together in both mathematical and musical. Indeed, love, divine order, music, and mathematics are simply four different ways of saying the same thing. Harmony, as a result, had come to possess a cosmic meaning. That is, as a manifestation of the music of the spheres, a political manifestation as seen in a well-ordered state, and a psychological manifestation as seen in a well-ordered soul. In each instance, The most accurate depiction of that state of order is taken from the realm of music. And so now we can see it going into trance music and all of this stuff, totally degrading this lineage, beginning with Wagner, which is really interesting there. Let's see. Similarly, the church fathers were forced to employ musical vocabulary when attempting to talk about love and the world order based on that love. Not because they lacked a scientific way of talking about these things, but because the underlying unity they perceived in the universe was essentially musical. St. John Chrysostom, in his Praise of Friendship, explains that Kithara as love sounds produced by it as the words of friends, the musician who brings about the harmonia, and the symphonia as power of love. The Pythagoreans had taken the notion even further, attributing music to the ability to cure disease. Theophrastus, according to Spitzer, states that gouty pains in the hip as well as snake bites are cured by playing the flute. The notion sounds slightly more than slightly absurd to modern ears. However, perhaps not as absurd as it might have 20 years ago. The Surgeon General announced recently that at the top of the causes of death, most were behavior-related and therefore avoidable. In an age when AIDS is one of the chief causes of death in New York City, the correspondence between the moral and the medical, the moral disorder in the former leading to physical sickness, does not seem as far-fetched as it might not have very long ago. I'm going to start there. I wanted to go on more, but I think that's a good place to pause there. Did you want to add on to that passage there?
About AIDS?
On that whole thing, and just about the order of life, and I don't know if this makes sense, but it's essentially it breaks it down to, I guess, what the right-hand path, or staying consistent with reality, with logos, with truth.
That's right. That became the big issue during the 19th century, because the 19th century was a century of revolution. Revolution had spread throughout Europe. What are you rebelling against? That becomes the question. It becomes a cosmic type of rebellion with Wagner and Tristan und Isolde, because there's a sense in which we all feel justified in rebelling against an unjust economic order. Okay, we can all understand that. We're in a situation right now where we had, in a sense, a rebellion with the election of Donald Trump. Okay, a rebellion against the oligarchic control of the country. What their revolution was, however, was a revolution against the order that God has created. If you do that, you're spitting into the wind, because what you're doing here is rebelling against Logos, and we are creatures of Logos. Logos is the only thing that guarantees our freedom. It guarantees we are only free to be what we are, and that is to be rational. So if you're liberating a human being from rationality, you're enslaving him. It's that simple.
Right, which is the whole... Well, I was just going to add, that was the whole agenda with Aldous Huxley and all of those out of the Frankfurt
that
School.
Is exactly what
Jiddu Krishnamurti, shut down your mind, don't think, don't use rationality, take a bunch of drugs, fornicate in the mud in front of your rock idols, back to Dionysos, and then so they created the fall of man, essentially.
Right. That's right. So if you're liberating man from the moral order, you're enslaving him to his passions, because that's precisely what Huxley is talking about in Brave New World.
Absolutely.
He had access to all of the advanced theories of social engineering that were being discussed at Tavistock, and then
absolutely,
and then back in the United States, he had gone to California, probably as an agent of Tavistock, to work in the United States. So
not only that, I don't know if you're familiar, Michael, but I have shown extensive evidence in several articles and probably several dozen shows that Aldous Huxley was actually the chief architect of the CIA's MK Ultra program, and that the MK Ultra program was, in fact, the counterculture in the 60s psychedelic revolution. Things like the Manchurian Candidate and this stuff by John D. Marks. Well, John D. Marks was the assistant to the director and or the director to the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And, he's putting out the scapegoat theory about the Manchurian Candidate to keep people focused on that, and so that they don't realize that the entire counterculture itself, being headed by Aldous Huxley, working with Timothy Leary, who was admitted CIA from at least 1962, and Gregory Bateson, and all of these characters out of the Esalen Institute, which was a CIA front, to, peddle this whole agenda to get people to stop thinking. All of these new age ideas and religions, etc., center around the Esalen Institute, and not only that, but they tie directly into changing images of man by the Stanford Research Institute, which was a project headed by Joseph Campbell, and also had Gregory Bateson and all of your typical key players in all of this right there with it. Anyway, go ahead. But to sum it up, though, your work is showing where it starts at the beginning with Wagner, at least at that point in the 1800s, and it spreads out through Nietzsche, and then we see it just explode into this, disastrous social mess where they're, trying to tell us that we're evolving by, destroying rationality and everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. At a certain point, there were people who became conscious of all of these elements and the potential that they had for political control. In the sexual realm, Wilhelm Reich was a crucial figure.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
His book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which came out in 1933, became the Bible for the use of sexual liberation as a form of political control. In terms of music, there's a break. It wasn't a direct tradition. There was a direct line of direct line of influence from Wagner to Schoenberg. Schoenberg's piece Verklärte Nacht is basically a smeared version of Tristan und Isolde. That's what his brother-in-law called it. That's what it was. And this was Arnold Schoenberg on board with sexual liberation. Unfortunately, Arnold Schoenberg's wife took it a little more seriously than he did. And she actually had an affair with a painter in Vienna. And Schoenberg was so wounded by this that he not only repudiated Wagnerian Tristan und Isolde, but he basically declared war on the music of the West. He reverted. He had been baptized as a Christian. He was a Lutheran, living the life of the Bohemian in Vienna. At this point, he repudiated Christianity and declared war on Christianity. And his war took the form of atonality, first of all, and then 12-tone music, which he basically stole from a man by the name of Matthias Hauer. That's all described in Dionysos Rising. The problem here is that the music was just impossible to listen to. Everybody hated it. I forget the name of the guy in Paris, said, the guy who wrote Johnny Spielt Auf, I forget his name now. Anyway, he said, if we had to listen to one more piece by Schoenberg, we all would have committed suicide. So it was with great relief that we welcomed the first jazz band, Negro jazz band, that showed up in Paris in 1919. George Antile, that's who was it. He said that. And at that point, the spirit of sexual liberation jumped from the classical tradition to jazz, to modern popular music.
And then we see the seeds of it from there exploding it, through what Harry Smith and the whole project, that whole project with folk music and everything, and then it just explodes into the whole rock and roll music scene.
Yeah, there's a direct line of connection between jazz and rock and roll. It's the Negro Dionysian. It was Negro music. The blues became very popular through folk music first, and then it became kind of rock and rollified when Muddy Waters ended up in Chicago. He was playing on a street corner, nobody could hear him, so he amplified his instrument, and suddenly you had what was proto rock and roll. Chuck Berry took it a step further, and if there's anybody who is the father of rock and roll, it is Chuck Berry. Eric Clapton and all those English guys all were just amazed at what he did with the guitar, how he could use the guitar to kind of dominate the whole piece of music. And they all became converts to Chuck Berry's style of playing the guitar in a combination with Muddy Waters and the blues and so on and so forth. That at that point, rock and roll took off. It became a white phenomenon. And it also, at that point, became part of the social engineering that was going on, largely through the drug culture. Jerry Garcia formed a band called the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead became an outlet for selling LSD on the West Coast.
Well, and we actually just finished a whole series, and I've written an article exposing the Grateful Dead's involvement in all of this, but we just did a 4-part series also with Hans Utter exposing the Grateful Dead, also their connections to the intelligence community and lots of other stuff there, and their work with, again, the Stanford Research Institute. They're all right out of the whole Palo Alto area with where a lot of this stuff comes out of. So we've actually...
Yeah, when you're dealing with LSD, you're dealing with MK Ultra, you're dealing with the CIA.
Absolutely.
They got involved with this. They were, it's mentioned in Aldous Huxley and Brave New World. They have the feelies, there's pornography, which is a form of control, but there's also soma, which is
absolutely
that intervenes. These people are all materialists, and basically what they see as states of mind are really just chemical reactions. So why don't we just go directly to the chemicals? And they thought at this point, in the 50s with MK Ultra, that they had some type of mind control drug that's going to be able to control people's minds, because it's all about control. That's basically the only thing they're interested in, is forms of control. It turned out differently than they expected. And to understand those permutations, it's good to talk about Timothy Leary.
Well, sure.
I mean, everybody knows he was associated with LSD and with the CIA, but at the end of his life, he said, I never stopped being a member of the CIA. I don't think it's that simple, to be honest with you. I think he got onto some type of grip, to use that term. It got out of control, and then suddenly the CIA realized the potential it had for taking control of the youth movement, which was
I wonder that
rebellion.
I wonder that, because I've actually done a lot of research into that. And, for instance, on May 13, 1957, Gordon Wasson, the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms, publishes the article Seeking the Magic Mushroom, about Maria Sabina and the Mazatec Indians in Mexico and all of this, which kicks that off. But on the top of the front of Life magazine, it says, magic mushrooms that cause strange visions, teenage allowances. And then also, if we look at, going back to Aldous Huxley, he releases the Doors of Perception, which, in my opinion, is probably one of the CIA's first publications as far as the MKUltra program goes. And then, so what he's doing there is he's promoting mescaline directly to the public. And then what I also did is I wrote an article called Entheogens, What's in a Name, which investigates the entire origins of the different names that they use to market the drugs. And what I discovered was that there were two groups. One was Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond working with Abram Hoffer, and they created phanerothym, which flopped. That was Aldous Huxley's word. They created schizophrenia. I think Abram Hoffer created schizophrenogen, And then Humphrey Osmond created psychotomimetic. And then these were words that they were using when they were testing the drugs at Harvard. And I'll send you my articles on this after the show. But then from there, they decide, you can read the quotes there. Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond are talking about, about a name for these drugs. What a problem. And he's talking about this whole thing because they're trying to come up with a new name for them that doesn't have any negative connotations, because Timothy Leary and Oscar Janiger are there, and they admit that before this remarketing program, that nobody who took the drugs had a spiritual or enlightening type experience, that the whole thing was a California invention. And then you see them remarketing the drugs, and then 3 months after Humphrey Osmond comes up with the name psychotomimetic, he then creates the name psychedelic, which is actually the only word in the English language with psyche, and then the ending, it's a Latin Greek mishmash, but it should be more properly psychodelic. And so then, Leary at Harvard, and with Huxley there working with him, he launches the Harvard Psychedelic Research Project, and they, recruit 40 Harvard doctors and hundreds of students, and suddenly everybody wants to take the drug. So now they know that the experiment was successful, so then they take it out to the public. And then in the 1990s, Professor Carl Ruck, along with Gordon Wasson again, and Jonathan Ott, and some of these guys, they rename the drugs yet again to entheogen, generating God within. So again, we can see this marketing tactic all the way through to get people to, basically accept this Dionysian drug cult. And, we have their quotes all the way through the whole project.
Yeah. Yeah, I think LSD failed for what they intended to do, how they intended to use it. It was not a control drug. It was too, what it created was too unpredictable. It couldn't be used the way they wanted to use it. And so they switched to other drugs. The tradition of using drugs to control populations goes back to the English, to Huxley's ancestors, in particular, the opium wars in China. England had a balance of payments deficit with the Chinese because they loved tea so much that they didn't want to use gold to pay for it, to go into the reserves. So they basically started growing opium in India and then selling it to the Chinese, enslaving the Chinese to addiction. This had a devastating effect on Chinese self-confidence, which has lasted to this day. Mao Zedong was in many ways the revenge that China took on the West for addicting it to opium. But it didn't, opium is much more suited to control than LSD. And that's why it is still in use today. I mean, I think the only rational explanation for America's presence in Afghanistan is to secure opium production.
Absolutely. Well,
I see no other reason for us to be there.
I have an interesting fact for you here. There is actually an article by a guy by the name of Mark Kleiman, and he actually talks about this in his book about, he says, again, it may be possible to target counter-narcotics specifically against the insurgency by selective enforcement that effectively tolerates pro-government traffickers and corrupt officials. And this guy, Mark A. Kleiman, he's from the U.S. Department of Justice. He was ironically tied with William Leonard Picard of the LSD missile silo bust. He's tied with Rick Doblin of the MAPS Institute, who promotes MDMA and all of these other drugs. But, we can see exactly what you're saying, because this article, it was written on, and they moved it, but it was, I think I have a copy of it here. Here we go. It was written on the drug policy and Afghanistan. It's drug production and trafficking, counter drug policies and security and governance in Afghanistan. And so, you are exactly right. There's one of the key government guys organizing drug policy who taught at Harvard's JFK Law School admitting that.
Yeah. I think we now have a heroin epidemic in middle America. And it's in combination with the other opiates, the prescription opiates, like OxyContin. And what you're seeing here is the target population seems to be what Hillary Clinton would call the people. The people who voted for Donald Trump are the people now where most OxyContin prescriptions are being written and where most of the heroin is being consumed. So it's hard not to see this as a form of control, and a much more effective form of control than LSD could ever be. The other thing we need to talk about in this regard would be the selective serotonin receptor inhibitors like Prozac and Zoloft, which would be not so much to exterminate the population, which is pretty much what heroin does, but to control the population. And those drugs, enormous amounts of those drugs were prescribed to people to keep them working, keep them at their jobs, at the system, while at the same time calming them down and making them docile. I think that's the key word here, docile, not inoperative, not dysfunctional, but docile.
Right, sure. One thing I wanted to say, Michael, to your point there is I don't think it's an either or issue. I think if one group will use heroin, one group will use methamphetamine, one will use mushrooms or LSD or, whatever. I think, the government is going to take advantage of that situation. And there's a really good quote here, and I'm going to share with you by Dr. Louis Jolyon West. And he says the role of drugs in the exercise of political control is also coming under increasing discussion. And this guy, by the way, Michael, is the famous CIA scientist who killed the world's largest elephant, Tusco, with a massive dose of LSD. And he says control can be through prohibition or supply. The total or even partial prohibition of drugs gives the government considerable leverage for other types of control. An example would be the selective application of drug laws permitting immediate search or no-knock entry against selected components of the population, such as members of certain minority groups or political organizations. But a government could also supply drugs to help control a population. This method, foreseen by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, has the governing element employing drugs selectively to manipulate the governed in various ways. To a large extent, the numerous rural and urban communes, which provide a great freedom for drug use and where hallucinogens are widely used today, are actually subsidized by our society. Their perpetuation is aided by parental or other family remittances, welfare and unemployment payments, and benign neglect by the police. In fact, it may be more convenient and perhaps even more economical to keep the growing numbers of chronic drug users, especially of the hallucinogens, fairly isolated and out of the labor market with its millions of unemployed. To society, the communards with their hallucinogenic drugs are probably less bothersome and less expensive than if they are living apart than if they are engaging in alternative modes of expressing their alienation, such as active, organized, vigorous political protest and dissent. Meanwhile, really quick, one last point here. This is really good. Meanwhile, the communards themselves use drugs like cannabis to foster social stability in a setting of relative non-governance. When tensions or hostilities arise, marijuana or hashish is quickly produced and passed around, and anger literally goes up in smoke.
There's a documentary called Berkeley in the 60s. And it talks, the beginning of this is the free speech movement. In the beginning, you have guys who have short hair and sort of button-down shirts, and they're talking about Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Jefferson, and they've got these rational arguments. By the end of the documentary, everybody is completely stoned. They're all sexually debauched, and they don't have a clue what happened to them. It seems to me that it was clearly what happened here is that there was a genuine protest against the draft, for example, against the Vietnam War, that got co-opted by sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Absolutely right.
I don't see any other explanation. And it's so clear, I don't understand why they don't see it. Because all they were talking about at the end, like I ruined my life. I'm now 67 years old. I don't have any children. I don't have nothing. My life went up in smoke, as you mentioned, but I'm free.
Right. Never mind that they have to rely on the state and, and socialism to take care of this.
Dope. I'm still smoking dope. I'm still listening to the same records, but I'm free.
Yeah, and they're going to be, free when the socialist government has to take care of them because they don't have family or extended family, which would normally fulfill that role.
Yeah. So it's a tragic story.
It is definitely a tragic story. I agree with that. So, there's a lot here that we haven't covered. I hope I can have you back again to cover more of this. I'd be
happy to come back. Happy to come back. It's been my pleasure.
Can you mind if we cover a few more points here?
Sure.
All right, so let's get into Mozart and the Magic Flute, both worldviews. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the Magic Flute is a Masonic opera. It's basically about liberation, the liberation that the Enlightenment is going to bring. The Queen of the Night is the Catholic Church. She's the villain. Zoroastro is the hero. There's that great aria, Die Strahlen der Sonne vertreiben die Nacht. It's like the hope of the Enlightenment. All we need is the light of reason as we define it in our truncated way, as if the church hasn't been promoting reason all these centuries, and everything will be fine. The companion piece to this, I say, in Dionysos Rising, was the aria in Tristan und Isolde. O sink hernieder nach der Liebe. So we went from wanting the sunshine of reason to wanting the night to come down so that nobody see
you're cut.
I'm screwing my neighbor's wife. The whole story of the Enlightenment in a nutshell. That's how it happened.
You were just cutting out a little bit there. I hope audio is straight now. But let's see here. Art and not politics as the true vehicle of revolution. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I could tell you a lot about that. I mean, I'm currently at work on a piece on the Cincinnati Ballet and the whole city of Cincinnati and how art was used as a weapon in the culture wars in Cincinnati. The crucial moment came in 1990 with the Mapplethorpe exhibit. Robert Mapplethorpe was a homosexual who produced a number of obscene paintings. The paintings were put on trial and the jury acquitted them, the museum director, because the museum director kept saying they were art. Well, once you bring art into the picture, all the normal caveats, they are all suspended now.
Right, and then you can have and then you can have somebody like Duchamp, writing his name on urinals. He was a crucial
figure, but recently,
you're cutting out there again, Michael. Do you have
a British newspaper? It turns out that the CIA.
Michael, do you have something else running from the internet in the background? You're cutting out there. Okay.
No, nothing.
All right, go ahead and repeat what you just said. Sorry.
So it turns out that the CIA was involved in modern art as well.
Absolutely agree with that.
They were promoting Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism beginning in the late 40s all the way through the 50s as a way of countering socialist realism in the Soviet Union. Soviet Union's official style of art. Our style, we were freer. We could just drip paintings,
Yeah, you're cutting out there again. I don't know what the heck is going on.
Jack the Dripper, drip paintings on canvas. You didn't have to stay within the lines. That shows that we were free. I don't know either. I'm just doing the same thing that I've been doing.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's see. Let's talk about eras for a minute. You state love, unlike mere sexual gratification, implies the activity of conscious agents.
Yes, that's the difference between human beings and animals when it comes to sexuality. Animals don't choose to have sex. Salmon reproduce when certain biological chemical reactions go off. They turn around, they start swimming upstream, they mate, and then they die. The whole point of human sexual activity is to include the person, the choice of the person. And the ancients understood that it's the myth of Amor and Psyche plays a crucial role in explaining this. Amor is a god who just wants to have sex in the dark. Psyche, which means soul, turns on the light and destroys animal sexuality because it brings consciousness to it. And so Amor flees, and it looks as if that's the end of this relationship. It is the end of a certain type of sexuality. It's the beginning of human sexuality, which is based on choice, freedom, and logos. In other words, understanding who the person is and then choosing that person as the vehicle of your sexuality. So what we saw with Dionysus is a reversion to the primitive, to the old notion of personless sexuality, which found its expression musically in Dionysian festivals like Woodstock, and then ultimately, I would say, in the bathhouses of San Francisco and New York, where we had completely anonymous sex.
Wow. All right. What about Heinrich Laub and liberalism?
Who is Heinrich Laub? Did I write about him?
Yes. Yeah, you did.
Sorry. You'll have to tell me what I said about Heinrich Laub.
Oh, well, I made a note of it. I'd have to go back through and find it. I've got flags all over through your book there, so it probably wouldn't be
there's been a lot of water over the dam since I wrote Dionysos Rising.
How long ago did you write this book?
I think it's like 20 to 25 years ago.
Wow. Okay.
I've written a lot of books since that time, so some of the details have escaped me.
You know what's funny, Michael, is that it took us 25 years and all of this research to get back to something that you did 25 years ago, and I had you on my other show a couple of years ago on RBN, and we still hadn't caught up to this aspect of your work yet, and then we discovered all of the same things from completely different angles. We're all looking at the same mountain from from different sides, and it's like, wait a second, and then somebody mentioned your work, and you sent me a copy of your book, and sure enough, it was all right there, and but yeah, great, because we came to the same conclusions: CIA involvement, creation of the counterculture, Tim Leary, CIA, Aldous Huxley, well, he was MI6 and CIA, the whole Huxley family, Thomas Henry Huxley and the opium fiasco in China, all of this stuff. This is all research that we've been exposing, and the present apex of the CIA's MK Ultra program, in my opinion, at this time, is Burning Man out at Black Rock, which is, of course, is a Saturn alien reference, out in the Nevada desert each year, and it's this huge intelligence operation that Steve Outram and I have been exposing. I'm editing part 6 of a long series on that right now. But it's great to have you on, because we're looking at so much of the same research, so I'm excited to have you back soon to cover more just about this book, because there's a lot of meat in here that we didn't cover tonight, so I definitely want to get more of that in.
Well, thank you. I'd be happy to come back.
All right, Michael. Well, that'll be a wrap for tonight. You want to give out your website?
You can reach me at jones@culturewars.com. That's my email. And you can go to our website at culturewars.com. All of my books are available, including Dionysos Rising.
Great, and thank you for so much for writing this. And folks, I got to say, Michael is a very eloquent writer. This is one of the best written and well thought out books I've read in a long time. Great reading. I really appreciate it. And also, ladies and gentlemen, please support the show. If you like what you heard tonight, really appreciate any donations. Gnosticmedia.com. Michael, you looked like you were about to say something there.
No, that's it.
Great. Well, I'll see you soon. Maybe we can have you back next week if you're free at this time.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. See
Bye-bye.
you soon. Bye-bye.